My parents were, I would probably say, we were the average run-of-the-mill family. My father worked as a surveyor, which got me interested in math and geometry when I was a young child. And then he went and worked for the post office when I got older. My mother went to work when I was 9 years old. She went to work full-time, and she worked at a prison in Elmira, New York, and it was her job to do the parole for the inmates when they were released. And after that job, she worked in the police station. So I would have to say that I came from, probably a very middle-class family, maybe even lower middle class at the time, and second out of our children. So I'd say pretty average background.
When did you first get interested in flight?
It's hard to put a exact time or period in my life when I got interested in flying. I think it was a very gradual thing. When I was a child of age 7 through age 12, I went to summer camp, and the summer camp was close to a glider field. And as we were going through our outdoor camp activities, we'd watch the gliders fly overhead, and occasionally we'd go out to the glider field and watch them take off and land, although my family never had the money to get me into a glider or to even get me in an airplane. I would watch the soaring activities, and I'd just start thinking about, hey, it might be fun to do this someday. And as the years went by, I got more and more interested in flying. And it wasn't until I was probably my first or second year in college that the Air Force started opening up flying to women, active duty flying to women. And I'm very interested, I used to be very interested in military history, and I had done a lot of reading back when I was a teenager about military pilots that flew in World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and I even read about the WASPs, the Women Air Force Service pilots who flew back in World War II. And it was just, with those activities in my life, just, the experiences from the reading in my summer camp, it was a gradual process. And eventually, I decided to take flying lessons. And that's when I really got interested in flying, because once I started taking flying lessons, I learned more about myself, that this is what I did well, this is what made me happy, flying in airplanes, but it was challenging. So I think that combination, I was hooked. And then I went off to the Air Force, and here I am today.
How did your parents feel about their daughter joining the Air Force?
Well, I remember when I first told my father I was joining the Air Force, he did not approve of it. He told me, no, I couldn't do that. He had a lot of suggestions of things that I should do, and they were good suggestions. He knew that I was good in math because, he knew that I enjoyed math in school. I got pretty good grades. I chose to take math courses when I was in high school. And, he wanted me to go into accounting or, be a math teacher, which would certainly have been good jobs for me, but I wanted to fly. So I looked towards the Air Force because I wanted to be in the Air Force, first of all, and the Air Force was just beginning to offer flying to women. And when I came back and told my dad a couple of years later that I could get a scholarship to college and the Air Force would pay for tuition, books, and fees, and would guarantee me a job after graduation, he looked at that program and thought it was very appropriate for me, and off I went.
And so he changed his mind.
Right, and my mother was very supportive all the way through this. Mm-hmm. My mother's a very independent person. She has been, ever since I remember, very strong person. When our family had tough times, she was the strong person that, would say, hey, everything's going to be okay, we're just going to, get through this. And she was a very good role model for me, and she was very supportive of the flying. And in the end, both my parents were very supportive, and I think it's very important for young people that are looking into a certain career field that your parents support you in what you do, because that just gives you that little bit of extra, I think, confidence in yourself as you go off to do whatever it is.
Do you have any heroes in particular in your field? I know you mentioned the WASP. Is there anyone, or anyone in particular Something has inspired you?
Well, there certainly are. There's an awful lot of role models in the world of aviation. You can go all the way back to the Wright brothers, or maybe even farther if you want. And people that really, they wanted to get off the earth, they wanted to fly, they wanted to go farther, faster, higher, which is what a lot of us pilots want to do. And I look back to the first women that flew. Bobby Trout is one person that comes to mind. She's probably 90 years old now, but I have a book of hers, and she was a famous woman aviator decades ago. Just a very extremely good pilot and extremely good person. And just to mention a few others, Jackie Cochran. I read books about Jackie Cochran when I was in high school, and I really admire her because she grew up in a very underprivileged neighborhood. I know that her whole family wasn't always there for her when she was younger, but she was able to overcome a very difficult childhood and go on to become a smart businesswoman, a very good pilot, and a creative person that was able to put together the Women Air Force Service pilots. Then in the 1960s, there was a group of women pilots who were actually looked at to possibly fly as astronauts in the Mercury program. And those women were, turned out that they were medically qualified, but they didn't actually get to fly in space because the requirements to be a NASA astronaut were that you be a test pilot. And back in those days, we didn't have any military women test pilots because women were not allowed to fly in the military back in those days. But there were many women that did fly. And back in the 1960s and 70s, we had our first women that flew as airline pilots. We had the first group of women in 1974 that were selected to be pilots in the Navy. And then in 1976, the Air Force selected their first group of women pilots. And then in 1978, NASA selected their first women astronauts to fly as mission specialists on the Shuttle. And all of those women, you know, going all the way back to the turn of the century, were role models for me and for other women who are pilots today. And we have a lot of, I would say, a lot of appreciation for those women and a lot of thanks for them.
What was your time like in the Air Force when you first started?
I went in the Air Force in 1978. Actually, to back up, in 1976 I joined the Reserve Officer Training Corps, and I went through the required training to be commissioned as a second lieutenant. And I joined the Air Force knowing that I was going to be a computer design engineer. That was the job that the Air Force gave me. But as I was getting ready to go off and do that job, the Air Force came to me and said, we have a new program. We're now taking women right out of college to go to pilot training. You know, although there had been a couple classes before me of more experienced women, this was the first time they were going to take women out of college. Would you like to volunteer? And I said, of course. So I volunteered. We went through a selection process, and I believe there were 6 women selected in this test program, and we went off to pilot training. And I would have to say that first year in pilot training, I was at Vance Air Force Base in Enid, Oklahoma. It was the first time they had ever put women through pilot training at that base. Myself and the other women were very welcome. We were treated just like the other students. The training was very fair. We were not given any special privileges because we were women, and on the other hand, we weren't asked to do more than the men. We were integrated totally in the program. I would say that pilot training was very difficult, and it's difficult for everybody because of so much that is expected out of you. The studying, the operating in a very high-stress environment, flying with a helmet and a parachute, you're breathing off of an oxygen mask, you're out pulling G's and doing acrobatics, you have an instructor sitting next to you that you think his only goal in life is to wash you out of the program. So, and that's the way it should be, training in the military, because you're training people to go into combat. You want people to be able to operate under stress. So it's a very difficult program, but for the women, the few of us that went through, it was even more stressful because we felt that we lived in a fishbowl. On that base, everybody knew our names. They knew everything about us. People recognized you everywhere you went. And you needed to learn how to operate, how to act, how to get your job done in that kind of environment without letting it get in the way of doing your job. And I thought I adapted pretty well to that environment because I really liked the military. I thought the people that I worked with were absolutely top-notch. I enjoyed working with the guys as well as the other gals in my class. And I'd have to say that the women in my class had very few problems. And I look back at my career in the Air Force, and I'm just very happy with the way everything has gone. I think the military is a very good career and flying is a very good career for young women.
And that experience, the positive experience, was transferred to becoming a pilot instructor too? Was that equally as...
Right. After I graduated from pilot training, the Air Force, everyone gets an assignment after graduating. Well, the Air Force assigned me to come back to that very base to be an instructor in the T-38 aircraft. And I was very happy that they did that because at the time, women were not allowed to fly in combat. So I could not go anywhere else and fly fighter aircraft, which is something that I wanted to do. But by law, I was not allowed to do that. This was back in 1979. The laws are different today. But they did select me to come back and be an instructor in the T-38, which is a high-performance jet. I was going to do that job for 3 years, and I thought, well, maybe they'll change the law, and in 3 years I can go fly a fighter. In the meantime, I got to do something I really enjoyed, which is flying airplanes, and I've always enjoyed teaching. So I had an opportunity to take two things that I enjoyed and put them together. For the 3 years that I was at that base, I was the only woman instructor in the squadron, and we had over 80 instructors total. We had some interesting times. I'd go out, I could tell you some stories if you were interested in hearing them, but we had many students from other countries, and some of the students actually asked not to fly with the woman instructor, and some of these were students from countries where women are not part of the business world, Middle Eastern countries, for example. So that was something that I accepted. I said, I'm not going to try to push anything like this because it's, a cultural thing, and I'm just going to do my job. And those were really the only incidents that maybe I was treated differently, but it didn't come down through the management. It was just, something kind of a side problem. But really enjoyed the job, and I think that the students, for the most part, didn't mind flying with a woman instructor. We got along pretty well. I had one student who was, he must have been 6'2", and football player type, and he was assigned to me, and we'd go out and fly, and I was just very proud of the fact that he wanted to learn, and learning from a woman or from a man didn't make any difference to him, and a very talented person. When he graduated, he went off to fly a fighter, and I was just very, it just feels good to look and see that your students have done so well. And this respect has developed between the two of you, between the instructor and the student, and that you are able to, pass along your knowledge to a younger pilot and then see him grow and develop and then go off and do a very important job in the defense of our country. And those are some really rewarding times for me.
I'll move on to the C-141. What kind of plane is that to fly?
Well, I flew the C-141 back in the mid-1980s. It's a cargo airplane. It's a large 4-engine built by Lockheed back in the 1960s. It flew during the Vietnam War. And the airplanes are now being decommissioned, and they're being taken out of active service in the military. But I really enjoyed flying the C-141. The airplane flew very nicely. It was a very well-designed airplane. But what I enjoyed most about the job was the concept of flying with a crew. I was an aircraft commander, and I usually have 1 or 2 co-pilots. I'd have 2 or 3 flight engineers. I'd have 1 or 2 loadmasters, and we would have a mission. And we would fly around the world. We'd take troops, we'd take cargo, we'd take whatever the Air Force needed delivered, or for that matter, whatever any of the military services needed delivered, we would do that. I flew all kinds of cargo, couriers, nurses, passengers, you name it. I've been into all kinds of remote places. and some places that we can't even talk about. And it was just a very rewarding job. As an aircraft commander, you took your crew and your airplane and your cargo, and you went and you flew somewhere, and you're on your own. And when you had to make a decision, it was you that made the decision. You didn't always have a direct telephone line back to, the command post that would. So it was a very rewarding job. I did that for 3 years, and I would have to say that job really prepared me to be an astronaut, or to be even a space shuttle commander, because of the type of mission, shuttling cargo and people up to space, and shuttling military cargo and people around on the ground. There are some similarities between those two missions.
How was it that you were able to move from the Air Force to becoming an astronaut? Or when did you make that decision that you wanted to pursue being an astronaut?
Well, I would have to say that when I made a decision to be an astronaut, when I decided I want to be an astronaut for my career, that happened in 1978, and that was the year that NASA selected their first women to be mission specialists on board the shuttle. NASA selected 6 women, and they all came up to Vance Air Force Base in Oklahoma to do their parachute and ejection seat training. Well, I was stationed at that base at the time, and there was a lot of media attention that the women astronauts were coming to the base. And I'd read I never got a chance to meet them, but I read the articles about them. I knew they were coming, and I thought, hey, I'm in pilot training right now. NASA's hiring women. That's what I want to do. And at that point in time, I started looking ahead in my career and deciding, what should I do to prepare myself to become an astronaut? I had no doubt that was what I wanted to do. I've always loved to fly. I've always loved space. I've always loved, the stories from the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs. And this was a chance for me to actually be part of that, to make my dream a reality. So I looked forward in my career. I looked at the requirements of what it took to be an astronaut. I needed to get a master's degree. I needed to get 1,000 hours of high-performance jet time. I needed to go to the Air Force Test Pilot School. So I looked out in my career and I picked jobs. And the Air Force doesn't always give you the job that you ask for first. Sometimes you second or third choice, which I did. But I was able to manage my career to prepare myself to be qualified, and not just to be qualified, but to be competitive to come here and apply to the astronaut program. And it worked.
How long did that finally take you through all the steps that you had to take in getting the master's?
Well, it takes, I would say, in 1978, when I decided I want to be an astronaut, it was exactly, I was selected to be an astronaut in 1990. So it took 12 years to get that far. Usually, to get the requirements to join the program, I would say you have to be at least 28 years old, maybe 30 years old, before you really get to that point. So it is a long process, and I knew it was going to be a long process. And it was important for me also to enjoy the job that I was doing at the time, and not just do a job to fill a square so I can move to the next job. And I think that's really good advice to tell young people: enjoy what you're doing right now and have fun doing it, and learn what you can while you're doing it. And do your best job in the job that you have right now. And that was the attitude that I had. But I also, in addition to that, I would plan ahead to make sure that I did the things I needed. There's so much, in fact, the job of being an astronaut, or even the job of applying to be an astronaut, which is a long process. It's very difficult to do, not just do the application, but to do the things that you need to do to be competitive. And nowadays, it is extremely competitive to get into the astronaut program because so many people want to be astronauts. My father and my mother have followed through my career all these years, and they have actually made it down for all 3 of my launches. So I'm happy to say that my family that has been so supportive has been able to actually maybe participate to a certain extent in my space flights by coming to Florida and getting a chance to see me before the launch, and actually getting to watch the launch and then follow the mission. And then after we landed, on all 3 of my flights, I was able to meet my entire family, my mother, father, brothers, sisters, my husband, and now my kids. So it's been really neat to have my family be part of this dream of mine.
What did it feel like to be an astronaut the first time you finally, wake up in the morning and,
Well, I think back to the day that I got the phone call from NASA where they told me, "Do you still want to be an astronaut?" I said, "Yes." They said, "Well, we'd like to invite you to Johnson Space Center next summer to go through astronaut candidate training." And I thought, does this mean I've been selected as an astronaut? Yes, it has. So in a way, it was kind of like pulling teeth, but I'll tell you, it was one of the happiest days of my life. And after I received that phone call from NASA telling me, "Come on down, you're going to be an astronaut," I went out and flew, probably within an hour of that phone call. And it was just a really great day. But I didn't have that very happy, let's go out and celebrate feeling. It was more like it's kind of hard to describe, it was more like, hey, I finally made it, and I feel like I'm in a position now where I can really make a contribution to the space program, which is what I've always wanted to do. Not necessarily me, Eileen, going up into space, but me knowing how important the space program is to people around the world, now being able to make a contribution in something that I really believe in. So it was more along those lines.
Can you tell us about your first launch? When was it and what were the circumstances?
Okay. My first launch was in February of 1995, and it was the Shuttle Discovery, STS-63. My crew was the first Americans to see the space station Mir. We launched to do a rendezvous, but not a docking, just a rendezvous to within 30 feet of the space station Mir. And on Mir, there were 3 cosmonauts. And obviously they knew we were coming. We were going to do a flight test to fly the orbiter within up to 30 feet and check out the space shuttle's handling qualities, flying qualities, the communication system, the navigation system. And it was really a total success. We wanted to do this rendezvous to within 30 feet before we attempted our first docking with Mir. And it was kind of like a build-up program. Instead of trying to do the whole thing at once, which may be a little too risky, let's do the rendezvous. If there's any problems, we can work that out after the flight, and then we'll go do the docking flight. And because our flight was so successful, just 3 months after that, we had our first shuttle dock with Mir. Now, on a couple other things to say about my first flight, we had, other than the Mir rendezvous, we had a spacewalk, and we had a small science satellite called Spartan that we released. And the Spartan observes various, in our case it was an astronomy mission. It observed a variety of astronomical targets, records the data on board, then we go back and 7 days later we pick up the satellite, put it back in the shuttle payload bay, and bring it home. So those were the major objectives of the mission. Now, from a personal point of view, a first flight for any individual is always it's just a real human experience. The 2 biggest memories I have from spaceflight are the floating and just the physical feeling of being a person in space, an individual in space. It's so different from getting around on Earth. Obviously, you have no gravity, but it's not obvious how you get around in space until you go up there and practice it. It's like learning how to roller skate. You're very awkward at first. You bump into people, you bump into the wall. You end up kicking your legs when you don't need to. And I went through that my first couple days in space until I learned you use your fingertips to get around. You don't need your legs. And the other, I would say, very human experience of space is looking back at the Earth. The Earth is just, it's mostly blue and white. When you look back at the Earth, it's almost all blue and white. Every once in a while, you'll see the deserts, which stand out. Australia and the Middle East really stand out because they're just very light tan, very bright when the sun shines on them. And occasionally you'll see jungles and forests that are dark green, but the majority of the earth is blue and white, and it's just so beautiful. Looking at sunrises, looking at the sliver of atmosphere on the curvature of the earth. I remember my first minute in space, I looked out the window and I said, they're right, the earth is round. But it was really the first time I saw a horizon with my own eyes that was curved. Obviously, we train a lot and we know what we're going to see up in space. We know Earth observation. We know how to identify targets that are interesting for scientific purposes. We trained on the cameras. We know how to take pictures. But there's nothing like looking at the Earth with your own eyes and just experiencing the feeling of literally flying. I'll put my face right up against the window so I can't see anything else, just the Earth. And I'll stretch out my arms. And it feels like you're a person by yourself just flying over the Earth. And it's just amazing. I really wish that everybody had the opportunity to have that experience. Someday, more and more people will have the opportunity to do that. Because after you go into space, you have a different appreciation of the Earth. You have a different outlook on the Earth. You don't, like when you drive to work in the morning, most people just think of, I'm coming from here, I'm going to here, and they think of their own little world that they live in. I don't do that anymore. I really don't. Flying in space has changed me. I have a very global outlook on things. As you fly the shuttle around the Earth, you're going at 18,000 feet per second. It takes 90 minutes to go around the Earth, and in 90 minutes, how many billions of people do you fly over down there on the surface of the Earth? It's just mind-boggling. And I think the other thing that spaceflight does for you is it kind of brings you out of yourself a little bit more, and you end up thinking more about other people and other issues and other things that are going on in the world. Something even as simple as, I want to travel to that place someday because I saw it from space and it looked beautiful, and I'm going to go there someday. And I feel that way for dozens of places on the Earth that I want to travel to someday. So, to me, maybe in conclusion, I should say, NASA goes into space for scientific research and to explore, and that's really our charter. That's what we do. But in that process, the individuals that carry out that policy, the astronauts, go through a very human experience that I think everybody changes, maybe some just a little bit and some more, but it's just an absolutely wonderful experience. And to me, someday traveling into space needs to be more than it is today. And things like tourism, I think there's definitely a market for tourism in space. We just need to get the price down. That'll happen someday.
Can you tell me what, then on the STS-93 was the one that you commanded?
Right.
What was the difference between the way you were treated, before when your first launch took place and then when you were actually commanding? Do you feel like you were, elevated, so to speak?
Yeah, a lot of people from all walks of life ask me how I was treated. People at work and friends and the media will ask me how I was treated, and I try not to ever think about how was I treated, because in the position I'm as an astronaut, I have to think about how am I treating other people? How am I doing my job? How am I making the mission work? Success, safety, are we doing the right thing? And I never really look at how am I being treated, because if I did, I think I'd probably have some problems thinking maybe about the wrong kinds of things. I like to take charge of situations, and if maybe I'm not being treated or some other person something isn't right, I just like to take charge and make it right. And I think as a shuttle commander, and this is true for all shuttle commanders, we are given a huge responsibility. Taking care of the $2 billion plus orbiter, your payload, which is, who knows what that costs. The space station, which you're going to go dock with, and many astronauts fly 4 months on the space station, you are given that responsibility by the American people. And they expect us to take care of, they're taxpayers, they're paying for the space program. So it is just very, very important that we stay so focused on the mission, safety, success, get the mission done the way we have defined the mission to get done. Now, I should say, maybe to just make sure we get the intent right, women at NASA are so integrated in the workforce that when you go to work on a day-to-day basis, you don't think about, am I working with a man or a woman? It just doesn't make any difference. We're working here on such a high level that things like what you look like, they don't matter. What really matters is, does this person know what they're doing? Are they the kind of person that I can trust? And we trust our lives to the engineers and the managers and the people that support the space program. So that's what really matters. Does this person know their job? Do they know what they're doing? So that's kind of the level that we operate on here. And I'm very happy that we do. This organization here just runs very, very well. And I'm really happy to be part of it. And you can look at the safety record, and I think the safety record kind of speaks for itself.
How would you describe the mission then that you commanded? What was that like?
Well, when I flew in STS-93, I had a crew of 5. We took up the Space Shuttle Columbia. This was in July of 1999. We launched a telescope called the Chandra X-ray Observatory, and Chandra's job was to, but on a 5-year, after we deployed it would be on a 5-year mission to observe the X-ray universe, something that we've never seen before, because this telescope is 100 times better than any X-ray telescope that had been launched before. And at the price tag, we had to take very good care of this and make sure that we successfully got this mission launched. And it was really a team effort. Everybody just came together. From a commander's point of view, and I saw this as a pilot, but I didn't really see it at this level until I became a commander. The fact that as an individual, obviously you make an impact, but you can really see the team effort, how different groups and different individuals join in to make the mission a success. And as a commander, I really saw that driven home. All the different teams that had put the observatory together, and all the teams that had gotten the shuttle ready to fly, and how they integrated it together. It was just amazing. And flying the mission itself was probably not any different for me than for any other shuttle commander, with the exception that I was the first woman to command a shuttle. So the only difference there from any other commander flying any other shuttle mission was the media attention. Within NASA, there was really no difference. Everybody just did their job. But the media came in as we got closer to the launch, and they wanted interviews, and they wanted to follow the crew around, and they really wanted to know more about me and my crew. And the pressure from that got to be a lot. And it got to the point that if we had done all the requests, we wouldn't have been able to do our training for the mission. So unfortunately, we had to turn down the vast majority of the requests that came in from the media until after the flight was over. So that, I think, there was a little bit of distraction from that, but we tried not to let that interfere with the mission. We were very happy to see the media attention, and we wanted to do as much as we could. But unfortunately, this is my opportunity to say I'm sorry to all the people that wanted to come and learn more about the mission and learn more about us. And I would say that was probably the only difference. Being a woman was the first woman. Now, when the second woman commander flies, I think it'll be a lot easier for her to run her mission, because there won't be as much of the external, I think, requests to come in and be part of the mission.
Okay, your husband is a pilot too, correct?
Yes.
How did you meet him?
My husband's a pilot, or was a pilot in the Air Force, and we met when we flew C-141s out in California. Actually, I had been in the squadron for 4 months, and I hadn't even met him because we're always traveling around the world, and we come back home and we check in the squadron to get our next mission to go back out again. So I just happened to catch him in between missions, and we met, and we, started dating, but for the next couple of years, we didn't really see that much of each other because we were flying so much. And then it wasn't until we had both transferred out of that job, we transferred into another job that was similar, that we really got to know each other. Living in the Air Force can be kind of challenging and tough sometimes because of all the travel that you do in many of the jobs, and the fact that the Air Force will send you different places. But we got lucky because the Air Force sent us to the same place. And from there we got married, and that was 14 years ago now.
You have 2 children?
Yes.
Names and ages?
Yes. I have 2 children, and I think for women astronauts or for young women that want to be astronauts someday, you can certainly have children and do your job. It's not easy, but I will say it's fun. You just have to have a very high energy level. My children are 5 years old and 8 months old right now, and I had my daughter between my first flight and my second flight, and then I had my son after my third flight. So you can even plan your families that way between missions, or if you already have children, you can still apply to the astronaut program and have children while you're here. So I would say that being a mother and being an astronaut certainly is compatible. I'll never say it's easy, but I would say it's compatible, and it's doable. And I think I have the 2 greatest jobs in the world, being a mom and being an astronaut.
Can you tell me about the difference between the ways that different space shuttles handle, like it's different planes handle different ways? Is there a way that the shuttles handle differently? They feel differently?
Well, we have 4 space shuttle orbiters right now, and actually I'd say all 4 of the orbiters, in my opinion, fly identical. The only time you can feel a difference in handling qualities or flying qualities is where you put your payload. If the payload is very far forward or very far aft, that will affect the sensitivity and the pitch axis. But otherwise, the orbiters are very, very much alike. The only other difference is Atlantis, Endeavour, and Discovery are all capable of docking with the International Space Station. But Columbia has not been modified to dock with the International Space Station. That's really the only major differences between the orbiters. And if you gave me an orbiter and I flew it, I wouldn't be able to tell you which one it was.
How was Mir, the repeated times that you went to visit? How did Mir?
Okay. On my first flight, we did a rendezvous with Mir, just to within 30 feet. We didn't dock, so I just saw the external views of Mir. My impression from that flight is that Mir was beautiful to me. The solar arrays were blue and gold, and the sun was shining on it, and it was like this big star in the sky until you got close to it, and then it was just this overwhelming, the color and the brightness. It was very, very pretty, actually. And being able to look at the cosmonauts in the window waving to us just added a human dimension to it. And then 2 years later, I flew my second flight, and we actually docked with Mir on that flight. There were 7 astronauts and there were 3 cosmonauts. Well, actually, there were 2 cosmonauts on Mir and 1 American, and we were going to do a crew exchange. And we were docked with Mir for 5 days. My flight was actually the flight that was, if you remember, there were 2 incidents on Mir. There was a fire in March of '97, and then there was a collision in June of '97. My flight actually docked in between those 2 incidents. And we were very curious about what the space station looked like and what its condition was, because we had heard the reports that the station was getting older. They were having leaks on the inside in their cooling system. And when we went on board Mir, I was actually very impressed with what I saw. I didn't expect to see the Hilton Hotel or any very touristy spot in the sky. I did expect to see a science laboratory, which is what I saw. and traveled all around the 4 major modules on Mir. And some of them were older than others. Some of them, 2 of them were actually quite new. And I found Mir to be very warm. The temperature was warm, a little bit on the humid side, a little bit of a musty smell like a cellar, basement. But it was a very kind of a warm and happy place to be, because the cosmonauts had it set up where they made us feel welcome. We had meals over there. They had music playing, Russian folk music. They had pictures hanging on the wall. They had, of course, their cameras and their videos and their tapes were also up there, along with their science experiments. And I just felt very comfortable on Mir. And when I came back, I was asked by the media and even folks here at NASA about my impression of the condition in general and specifically, and I thought that Mir was just fine to continue sending Americans up there. I felt very confident in doing that, just based on what I had learned here on the ground and then what I had seen up in space. Yes, it's kind of sad to see that the Mir was brought down and the end of an era, and it did kind of touch a spot in my heart when I saw Mir come down, and I just looked up there. I spent just 5 days up there, but I'm sorry to see it end. But we have the International Space Station now, and it's time to take our next step. So, I think Mir has made some great contributions, and the International Space Station program, we are so much farther ahead and so much more confident, the United States is, because of the time we had spent doing the Mir program with the Russians. We really learned a lot from that. We made great strides, and I am so happy that we did that Mir program, because it's just really helped us progress into our space station.
What is your role at NASA right now?
Well, in between flights, astronauts support other crews that are training and getting ready to fly, and that currently are flying. So for me, I'm in between flights right now, so I'm doing a support job helping the other crews get launched. I work in the safety office, and I look at certain issues that potentially could affect the safety of the shuttle flight. And whenever anything like that comes to our attention, we chase it down and we make sure we take whatever actions we need to make sure that that all subsequent flights are safe to fly. Also, I work as the weather coordinator at every launch. I look at launch weather and make sure that we, in conjunction with the weather people, and we have an airplane that flies and checks the weather out, we make sure that we meet all the weather criteria and that we're safe to launch purely based on weather. So those are the jobs that I'm doing right now. But in the past, I've done jobs with the shuttle program. I've done jobs with the station program. I've worked as a Capcom in mission control, talking to the crews up in space. And there's just a variety of jobs that astronauts do, really to help our buddies out while they get ready to go fly. And then when I train for my next flight, those other folks will help support my crew to get off the ground. So it's just a big team effort.
Do you know when you will be flying again?
Right now, I don't know when I'm going to be flying again. But, you never know.
I wanted to get back a little bit to Jackie Cochran, just talk about her a little bit, since I told you we were going to be profiling her. As I guess compared to you were saying that people didn't treat you really any differently in the Air Force when you worked there, and it was altogether a pretty good experience for you. How do you think the aviation world treated Jackie Cochran?
Well, if you look back to, back in the 1940s when Jackie Cochran was working on the Women Air Force Service pilots, she had a vision for women in flying, plus she also saw a need. The world was at war or getting ready to go to war, and there's a limited number of pilots in this country, and for those men who aren't pilots, you have to send them through pilot training and then, get them ready to go, to Europe or to the Pacific or wherever they had to go. And there was just a limited number of men to do the jobs. And Jackie saw that, and she said, hey, we've got women here in this country, hundreds and hundreds of women who have pilot's license. They can help out. For whatever reason, the women could not join active duty and go fight in the war, but there was a job here in the United States that needed to be fulfilled. That was ferrying airplanes around this country, you know, to the factories and to the fields and to the bases. And she managed to talk to General Arnold, who was running the Army Air Force at the time, into allowing this unit of women to be put together down in Texas. Sweetwater, Texas is where they did their training. And the women all had pilot's licenses already. They came in, they did their military training, and then they were dispatched out to fly, to ferry these airplanes. And the timing was perfect. It was just a very smart business decision on her part. And it was a strategic, I think, decision on the part of the war effort to really alleviate the demand on the men, because they needed to go fight in combat. So, you know, it was, in my opinion, just a smart business decision. And I think, when I think about Jackie Cochran, I think of her more as a businesswoman than a pilot, because she was really she was a leader, she was a creative thinker, and she was a darn good pilot. And you take that combination and put it together, and, you know, for her it spelled success. And she, although the decisions that she made were not always popular, you just can't help but respect her and look up to her, because she was able to make these things happen in a time when women really weren't part of the business world, and they really weren't part of the flying world. And, you know, I don't know if I was in her shoes back in the 1940s, I don't know if I would have done what she did. She just had a very unique, she had a gift, she had a talent, and she also had she was outgoing enough and confident enough in herself that she was able to make these things happen.
And she also came from rather humble beginnings, right?
You know, if you look at Jackie Cochran's beginnings, grew up basically in poverty and didn't have a lot of support from her family. It's just amazing that she succeeded. You would think that, you know, she would be just stuck in a cycle of poverty with nowhere to go, but that's why I say I think she just had a gift where she was able to, on her own initiative and her independence, get out of a bad situation and make life work for her and help others.
How important do you think the WASPs are to women in aviation today?
Well, many of the WASPs are still alive. They're in their 60s and 70s, and they are just so important. If you look back at the history of women in aviation, a few names jump out at you. There were very few women back in the 20s and the 30s, and even, you know, until we got to the 40s, there were very few women that flew. And when we got to the WASPs, you got your very first large group of organized women flying. That was just, not only were they first, but they were tremendously successful. And these women were good pilots, and they showed that on top of being able to do the job, they showed that they loved what they were doing. Years later, when the Air Force was, you know, this would have been the mid-1970s, was looking at bringing women into active duty aviation, they looked back to the WASPs and said, let's get some of this history. And they saw how successful it was, and that, yes, this can work. The main difference was in the 1970s, they integrated the women with the men. The WASPs worked really as, when they went out and ferried their airplanes, obviously they were out in the system, but they were trained they were trained in Sweetwater, Texas, only women. So that was really the main difference. But what the WASPs did was show that women can fly, and they can fly military aircraft, and they can fly in stressful situations in a military environment. And because they were so successful, we were able to get women in aviation later in the 1970s. So we owe them a lot. And, you know, I've actually had the fortune of meeting some of the WASPs and becoming friends with them. And I invited several of them down to my launches. And it's kind of like, you know, bringing the past and the future together. And I think that it's just been really neat that I've had the opportunity to do that.
I know you said you don't like to think about how people treat you rather how you treat people. But would you like to think that maybe being the first commander and all that you did leave your mark as the first female commander, that you kind of were another person at milestone?
Well, I think throughout my career I've had a couple of opportunities to be the first woman to do certain things. And I've learned, even back when I was in my 20s, when I was the first woman instructor pilot in Enid, Oklahoma, Advanced Air Force Base, I learned that you set a precedent when you're the first doing anything, and whether you like it or not, you're a role model. You can't reject that. You have to accept it as a responsibility. When young women come up to you and say, "I want to be just like you someday," or when your fellow coworkers, male coworkers, come up to you and say, "I felt a little nervous about working with a woman, but you're not too bad to work with." When people say those kind of remarks, you sit back and you go, maybe what I'm doing is more important than just going to my job every day, but maybe I'm actually setting a precedent for women to follow me. And maybe I need to take this seriously. And so I learned at a young age that when I talk, when I do, when I act, I'm setting a precedent for women, young women that will follow me someday. And I want to set a good precedent because I don't want to close any doors for them. So I've always been very careful about, for example, studying. I probably studied twice as much as I needed to because I was going to be the first woman here or the first woman there. I didn't want to make mistakes. I didn't want to do a bad job. I wanted to set a good example because it wasn't just for me. It wasn't just for the Air Force or the space program, but it was also for young women that want to do this job someday also. I don't want to ruin it for them. So I've always accepted a responsibility for that. But I don't think it was a stressful kind of thing. I would say it was a fun kind of thing because I really like what I do. And if you really enjoy what you're doing and you know that it's important, I think it's just fun. So I don't think I've had a problem with any of it. And I hope, as I look back on my life someday, I hope I can say, yes, I did do a good job for the young women that want to be military pilots someday, they want to be astronauts someday. The system says, well, the first women got through and they did okay, like the WASPs. Let's keep the women coming. And then finally the women are so integrated that nobody even thinks about it anymore.
Is there anything that I've left out, anything that you wanted to talk about?
Well, usually one thing I like to say is, I'm often asked, what do I need to do to be an astronaut someday? And I like to tell young people, just first of all, think about yourself. What do you like to do and where do you want to make contributions? Don't just do something, check off a square because I need to check the square off because I need to do it to be an astronaut someday. But really look at yourself and look at what you like and where you think you can make a contribution. And look at yourself in 3 areas. One is academics, another is extra activities, and the third is your health. And I'll tell young people, take those tough academic courses. You may not get straight A's, but challenge yourself. Take the tough math and science courses because in the increasingly technical world, you're going to need to know this stuff. The second is activities. It's very important to get involved in sports, community, and church activities to learn how to work as a group, as a team. Leadership jobs as well as, I shouldn't say job, leadership positions as well as followership positions, working on a team. And the third is your health. I tell young people, you got to eat right, make sure you sleep enough, stay away from drugs and alcohol. They are bad for you. They will not do anything good for you. Just reject drugs and alcohol and think about keeping your body very healthy because astronauts need to have very strong, healthy bodies. Heck, we all want to have strong, healthy bodies. So I'll pass on those 3 comments to young people that want to be astronauts someday, but frankly, they apply to all young people, no matter what you want to do in life.
How important is the ISS for the future of space?
The International Space Station, the way I look at the International Space Station Alpha is it's our next step in exploring the universe that we live in. It's part of exploring, and that is number 1. Now, Specifically, we can talk about the things that the space station is going to do as far as advancing technology, medical research, studying the Earth from space and the environment, bringing international countries together, working on a really interesting and exciting project, educating young people, inspiring and motivating people. There's so many things that the space station is going to do, but we've got to go back to the original. It's part of exploring. The space station is the next step to leaving Earth's environment and going either back to the moon or what I like to talk about is onto Mars. And I think that the next place in the solar system that we're going to visit that we haven't been to is Mars. The technology is here. I mean, we know how to get to Mars. The problem is we don't have the budget to go to Mars. Someday, somehow, we're going to have a budget to go to Mars, and I hope that I'm alive to see that day happen. What we learn on the International Space Station will be used to prepare people to travel 6 months to 2 years to get to Mars or back from Mars in the microgravity environment and be able to do that safely and survive the trip to Mars and back. So that's why we have the International Space Station. And frankly, if you just look at the investment that we're getting out of each dollar that is being spent, we're getting a huge return on our investment from space station. And I think it may be even years before we actually, can hold in our hand a drug that has been developed purely because of spaceflight, a drug that will possibly, cure a disease. And that's really, there's a lot of hopes in the International Space Station. I'm not making any promises. The only promise I make is it will be the next step in exploring. It is, because that's what we're doing right now.
How close do you think we are to sending civilians up there, aside from the people who can spend $20 million?
Well, actually, if you look at the civilian in space issue, there's a lot of different levels you can talk about that. You have very, very rich people that maybe can pay millions of dollars to fly a one-time flight in space, or you can look at the day where an average citizen can say, hey, my vacation next year, I'm going in space. And they can actually, it can be a reasonable budget that they can plan for and travel in space and do it routinely. So we're not there yet, but there's people out there working on making that option available. Because again, the technology is there. Right now the problem is with money. So how long is it? I don't know, but I think number one, if we have enough investment, people that are interested in investing in the research and the operations to get there, you need that. Number two, you need people, the customer that is willing to pay the big bucks initially to get the system going. And as we get the system going, you can start bringing the costs down, and then more people can travel. So I don't know how long that's going to take, but I would sure love to see that happen in my lifetime. Last night, my daughter asked me when I was going into space again, and I told her, well, I don't know, maybe in a year, maybe in 2 years, I'll go back up into space. And she said, Mommy, can I go with you? And I thought about that, and I said, maybe someday we can go into space together. Just hold that thought for a while, and maybe we'll have a chance to do that. And I think I'd like to be able to do that. When I retire from my job as an astronaut with NASA someday, I would like to retire with the notion that maybe I can fly in space again someday as a private citizen, and I may want to do that. I just hope the opportunity is there.